All right, guys, welcome back to our study in the book of Ruth. And this is a new study. And since Ruth is a little bit different than our normal study, that is, it's different than when we would study, say, for instance, the book of Ephesians, in that Ruth is given in a narrative style. So I tell you what, if you have not watched the introduction that I did on the book of Ruth, now would be a good time to go and check that video out before you actually get started with this one. But anyway, so Ruth is given in a narrative form. That is, in a story, like it's as if telling a story. And that's how God has chosen to reveal this particular truth. However, there is, or should I even say, there are a number of profound theological implications that are inside of the book. There are a lot of moral stories. There is a lot of wisdom in the book of Ruth. So we'll try to bring all of that out along the way. So it won't be the same as if we're studying one of Paul's letters. It's a different type of genre. That's why we say it's in a narrative form and told as a story. So anyway, let's begin with chapter 1 of Ruth, and we're going to only look at one half of the chapter so that we can discuss a lot of important information that's not found in the book of Ruth along the way to get an understanding of what's going on. Okay, but anyway, let's just simply get started. Now, it came about in the days when judges governed that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the land of Moab with his wife and his 2 sons. Now, I know this seems very simple, but there is profound amount of information that's actually found here as we open up Ruth and we look at this particular story. So it gives us a setting in the time period of the judges. Now, of course, guys, you know I cannot go back and deal with all of the things that are related, but we do need to understand the period of the judges. That is, okay, let's look at it in a general overall sense. From Moses leading the children of Israel out of Egypt, and Moses led them for approximately a period of 40 years. And then that generation perished and, well, actually was destroyed by God because of their unbelief and disobedience. But nevertheless, a new generation was thus prepared. Remember when the scripture says, all from the mouth of God, all who were 20 years of age below that time, it would be they who would inherit the promised land. And it was this generation that was brought into the promised land by Joshua. And Joshua and the elders that lived basically during his time. So at the end of that time, the end of Joshua, we get into the time of the judges. And this is what we see that is actually reflected in the book of Judges. So the book of Judges is roughly about 1400 to maybe like 1200 BC. So roughly in about that particular time. But the point is, this is a time when there was no king that led the nation as a whole, but there were tribal leaders who God would raise up as a deliverer, or we would particularly call that guy a judge at that particular time, or in the sense of a woman, because we know that Deborah was also a part of that. But anyway, beautiful book. One day we'll hopefully study that as well. But it was during this particular period. Now, the thing to understand is this was a period that was somewhat chaotic, or should I even say became chaotic as it spiraled downward. That is, when we consider Israel with respect to her obedience to God, that is, we have to remember that God had given them the law. So at this particular time, the law of Moses had been given. But the problem was Israel was not obedient to that law. And the nation became worse and worse and worse. And it was during this period that God would discipline the nation because of her disobedience. A lot of time allow enslavement to other nations, the lands to be conquered, the people to be ruled over by her enemies. And then the nation would cry out to God for deliverance, and God would raise up a judge to deliver the people, and the people for a short while would do right, just for a little while, for like the duration of the time of that judge, and then they would spiral downward even into worse sins. And so this is basically that period. But we're here now talking about the period of the judges. So we need to see that. The time of the judges. Remember, after the judges would be the king, that is, after Samuel. Samuel would be the last judge, and he would bring, therefore, after him, he would anoint the first king, Saul, then God's king, David. Okay, so we are in the period of the judges. Now, notice it also says, too, there was a famine in the land. And you always, whenever you read stuff like this, you need to always be thinking that a famine is a result of God's judgment. In other words, famine means no food because of no water, no rain. But remember, the people of Israel are under the covenant of the law of Moses. This covenant pertained to blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience. And one of the reasons, or one of the curses that we'll find, would be God would discipline his people with famine because of their disobedience to the law of Moses. So what we see here, what is inherently understood, if there is a famine in the land, it is because the people themselves are disobedient. So we have a famine in the land. Now, continuing on with verse number 1. And now we center in on a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah who went to sojourn in the land of Moab. So now, there is a lot of irony that's actually here, because notice this certain man hasn't named him right now, but it names the town that the man is from, Bethlehem. Bethlehem. That is, from the house of bread, because Bethlehem literally means in Hebrew, house of bread. And notice the irony that we have. There is a famine in the land. There is a famine in the house of bread. So we're concentrating on this particular man. But nevertheless, so this particular man went to sojourn. Now, this is also important too, as we'll see later on in this particular section. The word that is used here for sojourn is gur. That means that the man had a mindset to go down into the land of Moab temporarily. He did not intend to move and stay in Moab, but he was only trying to wait out the famine. So he was going to go to Moab temporarily to wait out the famine until he gets some relief. Okay. But again, let's keep going. In the land of Moab. Now, again, here's another one of those fascinating things. We find out, okay, first of all, here is where the history is needful. When Israel was coming out of Egypt and was trying to go into the promised land, in their so-called guiding by God through the wilderness, they were going to pass through the land of Moab. And this is ancient. It's way back in the time of Moses, roughly about, and when I say roughly about, don't pinpoint it, but to give you an idea of the time. But during the time of Moses, 1400 BC. And so they're going to pass through the land of Moab, and the king Balak was intimidated by Israel, hearing about what was going on with Israel as they had passed through other lands and the mighty things that Israel's God was doing, he refused to offer them bread and water. I'm actually in Deuteronomy 23. This is important. But what happened? And so he hired the false prophet Balaam to curse the people of Israel. I think that's Numbers 22 through 24, those particular chapters. But Balaam, the false prophet, trying to conjure up, he tried to use the name of Israel's God to curse Israel, but he could not do that. God did not permit him to do that, but instead of cursing them, God caused him to bless Israel. And so, but nevertheless, all of this caused a big old problem. And in this whole situation of Baal of Peor, okay, I am not supposed to get into all of that history. But anyway, through the conundrum that took place because of the counsel of Balaam to Balak, Israel was disciplined by God. 1,000 of the leaders were beheaded, 23,000 people, because he seduced them into idolatry. That is, even though Balaam could not curse the people of God, he could make them become accursed of themselves by breaking the commandments of God, that is, to engage in idolatry. Remember Exodus chapter 20, I am the Lord your God, no other gods besides me. Cardinal and chief commandment. And so what did he do? He introduced women who were involved in the worship of idol gods to seduce the Israelite leaders to try to seduce the nation into the worship of Balaam, and thus making God trying to curse them. Now, God didn't curse them, but God indeed did strike them in judgment. Okay, but anyway, and so what came out of all of this, God commanded in Deuteronomy 23, because Moab did these things, that Moab was to be ostracized from the assembly of Israel. Israel was not to seek the peace, nor the posterity, or the, prosperity, the peace, nor the prosperity of Moab. And the idea would be for 10 generations. Oh, I like this part too. For 10 generations, for a long and extended period of time. Now, I don't want to get into a lot of the issues about what the 10 generations mean. It can mean literally 10 generations. It could mean for a very, very long period of time, or it could be in a sense of like forever. But the point that is, for a long period of time, Moab was, the children of Israel were not to have anything to do with the Moabites because of what they did to the children of Israel in causing them to lapse into idolatry. And thus God decreed unto the 10th generation, no Moabite could come into the assembly of God, assembly of Israel. And this is important as we see in this story as he develops. Okay, so all of this we can see in verse number 1. So here we have this man from the house of bread during the time of famine going down into Moab, a place that has been forbidden for the children of Israel to have anything to do with. So it's not starting out as a good thing. And one of the things that we see here is, now we're not going to talk about this in a great detail, but what we can infer here is, number one, clearly seen, disobedience by the nation of Israel. There would never have been a famine if they were obedient to the covenant laws of God. And then we see a sense of disobedience and faithlessness by this particular man. Why? He went down, let me say it this way, into the forbidden area, that is, into Moab. Moab was said, don't have nothing to do with the peace nor the prosperity of the Moabites. Okay, so it was kind of like considered a place off limits. So we can clearly see the faithlessness of this particular man. Okay, and this is going to even be highlighted even more. But before we do that, let's just continue with the story. And also he took his wife and his 2 sons. Let's continue. The name of the man was Elimelech. And now let me just pause. I'll just do it this way. And it is also interesting too. There's a sense of, I don't know, I kind of want to say a perversion, or even we can highlight the man's faithlessness as we look at the play on names. For the name Elimelech, the Hebrew meaning of the name literally means my God is king. My God is king. So therefore, what? Let's bring it all out. If indeed your God is king and you are dwelling in the land of bread, Bethlehem, should you not wait on your God to provide bread? No, he didn't wait on his God to provide bread. He went down into the forbidden land of the Moabites. So you can see the perverse humor of the story as it depicts, in a sense, the faithlessness of Elimelech. And then it continues to say, and the name of his wife, Naomi, which means something like pleasant. There's a lot of play on names in the book of Ruth. But anyway, the name of his wife is Naomi, pleasant. The names of his 2 sons, now notice this, Mahlon, which means something like weak, and then Kilion, which means something like pining or debilitating or getting weaker or whatever. Ephrathites of Bethlehem in Judah. So the names of his 2 sons, I don't know what that seems to imply. Maybe they were sick at birth or something like that. But nevertheless, the name seems to give off a negative inference. Weak and pining or debilitating for the names of those 2 sons. So it seems a very negative picture with respect to the names, with respect to all except Naomi. Naomi being pleasant. Elimelech, my God is king, but you're not acting like it. And then the 2 sons, weak and pining or debilitating, but nevertheless, they were from the city of Ephrath in Bethlehem of Judah. And so they entered the land of Moab and remained there. So now Elimelech has taken his family to the land of Moab. And the idea is, in hopes of finding food, in hopes of a better life, in hopes of attaining prosperity. Don't you like that? What did God say in Deuteronomy? Do not seek the peace or the prosperity of the Moabites. But that was exactly the hope of Elimelech as he took his family down into Moab. And what happened? Verse number 3. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. And in verse 3, we see the first instance of tragedy. Notice, Elimelech died, and I like that too because it also begins to push forward one of the primary characters in the book here, which is Naomi. Notice how it refers to Elimelech, the husband of Naomi. He died, and the whole sense. Let me talk us through this thing a little bit, because the Bible is giving this in a narrative form, and it also is trying to cause us to really think about the situation as a whole. Elimelech had purposed and planned to go to Moab to escape the famine, to achieve some sense of prosperity, or even in the very least, survive. He wanted to survive. But what happened? Instead of surviving, he died. So, wow, it's just everything is not working out as he planned. As a matter of fact, His intention was to go. Remember, I told you what that Hebrew word gur, translated sojourn. He intended to go to Moab and return, but he went to Moab and never returned. He died in Moab, which even lets us know sometimes we make plans, sometimes we do things and we don't truly consult God, and sometimes we don't abide by the word of God, and it doesn't always work out the way we plan. And those things that we're thinking that are going to be for our good, it actually turns out the decisions that we made turns out for bad, because he thought he was going to do a good thing, but what happened? We don't want to call it bad in the sense of evil, but bad in the sense that it didn't work out the way that he planned. He ended up dying and never returned back to the land of his fathers. And what the situation with Naomi, she is now left with her two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. Now, the idea concerning these two boys, they are men, they are grown men. So you have to also keep in mind, I tell you what, I'm not going to talk about that until we go down a little bit further. Let's go. So they took for themselves Moabite women as wives. Now, here's something you start to think. So, okay, now that's dangerous. Why do we say it's dangerous? Remember the law of God. Moabites, there was a negativity concerning the Moabites with respect to what I just told you guys earlier. The Moabites did not allow, through King Balak, the Balaam whole instance and all of that stuff, the children of Israel, they seduced them to idolatry, and thus they were prohibited from entering into the congregation, the assembly of the Israelite. That is, in worship, a part of the community, things of that nature, even up until the 10th generation. So beautiful. And I'm trying to slow myself down from talking about that right now. But so the danger that you begin to see is taking of the Moabite women. So if dealing with the Moabites is a negative thing, do you think that you should take a Moabite as a wife? So again, it's like slippery territory to marry a Moabite woman. But now what I'm struggling not to talk to you guys about is that prohibition until the 10th generation. How beautiful is the orchestration of God. How beautiful is the providence and the timing of God. For it is literally about the 10th generation from the which God gave the commandment in the book of Deuteronomy concerning the Moabites, that prohibiting them from entering into the assembly of the people of God. It has been about 10 generations since these things have taken place. So therefore, we can see the allowance in the mind of God as these events take place. Because remember, now why am I saying this? We know that at the very end of this book, Ruth is going to marry a Jewish man by the name of Boaz, from whom will be from that family, Obed, Jesse, and King David. From King David, who? Jesus the Messiah. Jesus comes from the lineage of Ruth the Moabitess, the people who were once forbidden to enter into the assembly of God. It's so much wonderfulness, the mercy of God, the forgiveness of God. Ruth the Moabitess, a Gentile. Thus you can even see Jesus having Gentile. Jesus is both Jew and Gentile. He gets that Gentileness from Ruth the Moabitess, a people who were once forbidden, a people who were once estranged from the assembly of. Okay. Beautiful in the story. That 10th generation stuff is beautiful. But anyway, let's go back. Let's go back to what I'm talking about. So what happened? So verse number 4, they take the Moabite women as wives. Name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth. So the name of the one, Orpah, is kind of weird with these Gentile names, head, neck, and the other was Ruth. And the name for Ruth has to do with something about to be filled or to drink of abundance. But anyway, it gives the sense of abundance, and that does make a lot of sense. And they lived there about 10 years. And thus now we have the background setting for the book of Ruth. Famine in the land. Elimelech, the man, makes the decision to try to escape the famine so that his family can survive and prosper, goes down into the land of Moab, a land that was basically, for the sense, Israel was not to have anything to do with, but nevertheless, that's where he's sent, leaving the house of bread and forgetting that his God was king who was able to provide. His name, Elimelech. But what happened? It didn't turn out the way that he thought. He ended up dying. So his sons still living there, and notice we can begin to see a change in the mindset. What? A change in the mindset. Why? His dad, Elimelech, took them down there to sojourn, no doubt to outlive the famine. And it seems that they were beginning to take root in the land. And so instead of going there temporarily, they had began to really establish themselves, taking on the wives and things of that nature. So the boys now have married these two Gentile women, and we are introduced to our primary heroine for this particular book, from the which we get the name of the book, Ruth. And she is a Moabite. And so it takes us now to a period of about what? They were there for about 10 years. Verse 5. Then tragedy struck again. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died. And the woman was bereft, that is Naomi, of her two children and her husband. And so now we have calamity, for Naomi has struck, you can kind of consider it as calamity to the fullness. First, her husband dies. Then her two sons die. Now, what I was about to tell you guys, and I hesitated, I now tell you. You have to understand, in those ancient times, women did not work like women do today, especially like American women and all of that stuff. Women didn't particularly provide for themselves. Their husbands provided. And so what happened as the story started with Naomi as they entered into the land of Moab? First, her husband dies. So that's tragedy number one. And also, two, the first leg, if you'll let me say it that way, of her provision. Her husband died. Now that's scary. But she had two adult sons who were responsible for her provision, to take care of her. And now remember, the sons also had wives. So the sons had to provide for their houses as well as for their mother's houses. But now one thing that is also clear too, we'll find it in the text, the sons had no children. So there were no children here, just these grown people. But the problem here, since her sons have died, there is no provision for the women, no provision for Naomi, and no provision for Orpah or for Ruth. Usually when something happens like this, remember, there are no more children, there are no more men. It reduces the women to poverty because, as I said, the women don't work. And so therefore, when something happens this way, unless the women acquire a husband, they need to get a husband, then the women will be reduced to poverty. So calamity has stricken. Now look at this situation. Naomi, through her husband Elimelech, they tried to escape from their homeland to escape poverty. And what happened? They get now into Moab, and poverty has followed them even to Moab with the death of her husband and both her sons. So she has been reduced to the very bottom of life. So now you can see Naomi in the grips of despair. And a thing that you need to see here also too, one thing that cannot be denied, and we cannot fully explain the reasoning, God, the providence of God, that is also being spoken of here. When we say the providence, God's hand is involved. How and why and all of these things, we don't know. No one can ever really say unless God tells you why he did a particular thing. We don't know. But one thing we do know is the hand of God is present, and Naomi herself is going to say that. And she's going to say that from a negative point. We just don't know why. But anyway, let's just go on so this won't be too long. So, husband dead, 2 sons dead. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the land of Moab. Why? For she had heard in the land of Moab that the Lord had visited his people in giving them food. What a striking turn of events. She left the house of bread because of famine, went down to Moab thinking things would be better. Things actually got even worse. And now all of a sudden she heard that God did what? He gave bread to the house of bread, to Bethlehem. She heard that God had visited his people. And so now she makes up her mind and says, I might as well go back home. And so now begins, she makes the decision. And I want you guys to try to feel that. The decision of returning back home. But Naomi understands, as we're going to find in the text, she's not going to return back home as she left home. She left home with a husband and 2 sons. But in her mind, she is thinking she's going to return back home all alone and with nothing. But let's continue. So she departed from the place where she was, verse number 7, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. And Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, go, return each of you to her mother's house, and may the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. May the Lord grant you that you find rest, each in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. So what happens? So Naomi makes the decision to return back to Bethlehem. And so she understands she doesn't want to bring her 2 daughter-in-laws back to Israel. Remember, again, that's why that history is so important. It's probably, as Naomi's thinking in her mind, it's going to be a negative environment. Remember, these women were Moabites. What was the restriction concerning? No Moabite is to enter into the assembly of God. So no doubt through the years that this commandment has been in effect, even until the 10th generation, there has been a sense of prejudice and hostility towards any Moabite. No doubt Naomi wants to spare her daughter-in-laws this indignity that they would incur, no doubt incur, if these Gentile women were to go back with her. So she tries to spare them, and she simply says, okay, I got to go back home. It's going to be bad for you girls. Don't come back with me. So she says, go return each of you. And I like when it says, to her mother's house. Notice, usually it would be to the father's house. But again, it keeps that mindset of God is really honoring women in the story of Ruth, to her mother's house. And so she wishes them in a sense of a blessing. She wishes them well because they have been good to her, to her sons who are now dead, you've dealt kindly with the dead, and her daughter-in-laws have been good to her. You've dealt kindly with me. And she wishes them peace and prosperity for the remainder of their lives, and hopefully that they would find new husbands who will be able to provide for them, and each find rest in the house of her husband. And so she kissed them, and they wept with each other. So she kissed her daughter-in-law. That was her mindset, Naomi. She kissed both Orpah and Naomi a sad goodbye. So you can sense the love that they had for one another. Verse number 10, but they said to her, no, but we will surely return with you to your people. But Naomi said, return, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may be your husbands? Return, my daughters, go, for I am too old to have a husband. If I said I have hope, if I should even have a husband tonight and also bear sons, would you therefore wait until they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is harder for me than for you, for the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me. So the daughter-in-laws still plead with Naomi. They say, Naomi, we're going to go with you. And then Naomi tries to reason with them and simply says, what? Okay, in me there is no hope. That is, she understands the custom of levirate marriage. That is, remember now, both these women married her two sons, and the two sons, there were no children. And so therefore, with these two sons being dead, if Naomi had other sons, these sons could marry these women. They could marry Orpah and Ruth, and thereby bring up children for their dead brothers. That was the custom in that day. If a man should die leaving no children, then his brother or next of kin had the responsibility of marrying the wife of his dead brother to bring up children so that the name of that dead brother would not be forgotten, to keep the name alive. So Naomi, being an old woman, having no husband and having no hope of being able to even have children, she appeals to her daughters to say, I'm dead. There is no hope in you abiding in me. If you were to even come with me, I don't have children. And even if I got married, I couldn't have children. But even if I could have children, would you abstain from a husband, from any kind of sexual relationship, to wait until those boys were old enough to marry you? And then, no, this is an impossible situation. This is a hopeless situation. In me, Naomi, my daughters, there is no hope for you. So therefore, I'm urging you, just go back home and try to make a life and find a life for yourself. And then she ends to say, for the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me. And that's how Naomi sees her particular situation in a very, again, this speaks of the providence. This is what we were trying to say earlier. It is clear God's hand is involved, but is it against Naomi? I don't know. I don't know if we can really even say for sure to say that it is against Naomi, but we can say God's hand is at work. When we look at the overall book of it, what happens, what is brought out in this story? Ruth sticks with her. Ruth gets married. David comes from Ruth, the great king. the one chosen by God. So clearly, God was in the picture, and God will use the grief, and God will use the pain to bring about his will. So therefore we can see the providence. So I don't want to say happy ending. I don't like that. I don't like that. But I can say, like the Apostle Paul, Romans 8, and we know that God causes all things to come together to work for the good of those who love the Lord, to those who are the called. And we can see in Ruth the called, through Naomi the called, the beautiful, the providence of God, how God works even in our grief, not always to the happy end that we want, but God does according to his will. God does what is best for us, what is good for us. And the ultimate purpose is God brings about his will, even in our grief. Even when we don't know, when we don't understand, when we don't have the answers, when we go out full and we return empty, God is still at work, and you must trust God. And that's what we can see here. Trusting God. So we see a picture, Elimelech. There is a picture of the failure for the trusting of God. And by the time we get to the end of the story, there will be a building for trust in God. But anyway, okay, I didn't mean to preach, but so beautiful as we have just opened up the beginning of our study in the book of Ruth, and from the perspective of Naomi. So we are left with the two main characters of the book thus far: Naomi, the mother-in-law, and Ruth, her daughter-in-law. And we end it at this particular time here with Naomi trying to convince her daughter-in-laws to remain, to just stay in the land of Moab. It's better for you in your own land. Find a husband, and I pray, thank you for all you've done for me, how good you've been to my sons, and how good you've been to me. And I pray that the good Lord would bless you to find prosperity and a life in your own homeland in Moab. And that's how we leave this particular story. So join us next time, as we'll find out that one of her daughter-in-laws, that is Orpah, will yield to the words of Naomi, and she will remain in Moab. She'll return back to her homeland, to her people and her gods. But Ruth will stick with Naomi through thick and thin. So join us next time as we deal with the loyalty of Ruth.